All right, so I'm going to be giving something of a slightly researchy talk. It's going to have two mechanisms, but I think it's only fair if we're going to unite these two mechanisms about around like grant funding and retro funding that I give you a sort of a thematic tie. So we're calling it retrofuturism, which is this idea that you're trying to remember what you used to think about the future. You know, it's like what was our imagined future once back in the day. And so the idea is that that essential concept of remembering what you used to think about something is something very, very powerful in grants funding, particularly the sort of interesting way we like to do it in the Web3 space. And so the two mechanisms I'm going to talk to you about are going to both kind of use this theme, and I'll come back and try to remind you why and exactly how it does. It's big. Optimism has done some really cool experiments, right? Like there's a lot of money being given out. Right, we have a lot of other projects in the space doing it. What Jonas from Optimism. I think one of the reasons it's especially interesting right now is that in the last sort of bull market, 2021, 2022, there was this kind of like grants funding nightmare where you saw a bunch of people saying, hey, I'll give you grant money if you do this. And then you'd have these roving bands of mercenary units like fulfilling at best the minimum requirements for a grant to build something and just doing it for a bunch of different systems at the same time. Projects tended to find that was not a very successful way to build an ecosystem. So alternatives for just ecosystem funding is one reason you might care about this. And the approach, you know, in that context would sort of say, well, build something useful and then we'll fund you after the fact, right? But I'm going to argue two challenges it faces are you have a lack of supporting institutions, which it's a big, interesting new idea. You're obviously going to not have a full infrastructure of supporting institutions right off the bat. And secondly, it's probably going to suffer from mission creep, or what I'm going to call futurism creep, because remember, we got to keep to the theme here. And that's just the idea that it's a new enough idea that it's going to be hard not to slip into sort of old ideas, and thus it may not even get a fair shake. Why would you actually want to do RPGF? My essential answer is it's a novel and interesting approach as a way to fund public goods, and I think it's worth a try. So essentially, I'm just kind of say we should try it to see if it works. But there are other reasons you might think it's better or useful. First mechanism, we're done sort of stage clearing here. And I think the way I've outlined this idea of retro public goods is that it's something that's surprisingly useful. I think that's actually in Vitalik's original paper about it, right? It's something where you don't think it's going to be useful, and then when you hear about it, or once you see it built, it turns out to be useful. A retro public good is something that looks like the orange curve before it's built, right? Where you have that mass on the low utility part where everybody's just kind of like, yeah, I don't get it. But then after it's created, it looks maybe more like the blue curve, right? Where people are like, oh no, I can actually see the point, right? So that shift from the way a curve, you know, the utility would look to people before it's built versus after it's built is one way of kind of codifying what we mean by a retro public good dynamically. We're going back and we're saying, what did you all used to think about this idea before it was built? And we're using that and comparing it with your opinion of what you now think it is now that it is built, right? And the difference between those two is our metric. So that's the retrofuturism piece. We're remembering what you used to think about the future. The journey then, summarizing everything, would be you apply for a grant round up front, e.g. like a Gitcoin round, and then you get that sort of like early assessment of how useful people think what you're building is going to be. And maybe you're pleasantly surprised. Maybe it turns out the world gets it, and then you can just go through the normal process, right? But let's say they don't get it. You think you're going to build something that's more useful than people expected. You sign yourself up as a retro profit organization making this commitment. And then when you show up to the round, people see that commitment and they pay extra special attention because you're not just a Chrysler building, right? And then you apply for this bonus retro public goods funding. So what are the challenges? First, is it venture investable? I mean, I think the answer is probably no right now, but in theory, the answer is, of course, yes, right? Like in theory, if you're creating this much value, there's a world in which you could capture that much value. And if you can redistribute that value back to shareholders, then yes, it's investable. But I think that's one of those things that's probably would really have to be proven out before people are willing to make a sort of like unicorn style traditional VC investment. And you probably want to see RPGF rounds look a little different than they are. I think right now we're kind of excited about how flat and widely distributed RPGF rounds are. Probably a world in which we're seeing venture investable retro profit organizations is a world in which we're seeing really, really spiky distributions where some organizations who created a lot of value are getting a lot of it back. And maybe we see that, maybe we don't. So how gameable is it? That would be another one. If you think through that earlier mechanism I talked about where we're sort of like linking Arbitrum and Gitcoin, if the funding amounts are a lot different, you might imagine people sort of shading down. But then if you think that through, it's like, you know, maybe prevents them from existing in the first place. It's just a little complicated, and I've clearly just done a partial equilibrium, not a general equilibrium model here. So you know, probably work to be done there. And then my favorite piece is, can you slash retro public harms? As a theorist, I love this. The idea that you say you're gonna you're gonna build something and you build something bad, or you don't do what's expected. Is there something that you can be put on the line? Because it's essentially just the flip side of the whole thing we're interested in, right? If we're gonna reward you for retro public goods, can we penalize you for retro public harms or retro public bads? I think that's really cool and interesting. In practice, the idea of like slashing somebody's business doesn't sound super nice. So I'm not sure about putting it into practice, but couldn't help but mention it. Just to sum up, this is the retrofuturism theme, right? Both the mechanisms we've talked about have been ways of leveraging the earlier opinions of relevant people and what they thought about the future to sort of better understand what sort of goods we're funding, right? In the first case, it was what did the users, the potential users or community think about the use beforehand, and how did that compare to what they thought after? And the second one is what did the people starting the business think about their ability to capture profit? And so both of those are being used across these two mechanisms, and then hopefully it could be interesting to sort of link this cool upfront grant infrastructure we have in Web3 to the sort of like ex post RPGF infrastructure we have in Web3, and that could be I'm pretty hopeful about that as an interesting way forward. So I appreciate you helping, or you listening, and take any questions.